Everybody, this is Gene Montrestell, and welcome to the Tapping Q&A podcast, where every single week we answer the most common and uncommon questions about tapping and EFT, so you can eliminate self-sabotage and take the action that you want. Just as a reminder, at the end of August and the beginning of September, I'm doing the Mastering the Art of Delivery training, and I'm actually doing it 4 times now, where before I'd announced that I was doing 3. I've added a 4th weekend specifically for the folks who are in Europe and Africa. And what I mean by for people in that area, each of the 4 weekends starts at a different time so that wherever you live in the world, you have the opportunity to experience the training in your daylight hours at a time that makes sense for you. If you use the discount code podcast when you go to mastertheartofdelivery.com, you will get 50% off. And if you're in a situation where you're looking to do a payment plan for the training, a few people have asked for that, just send me a note, Gene, Gene, at tappingqanda.com, and we will get you hooked up. Masteringtheartofdelivery.com, coupon code podcast.
I've discovered that when a trauma happens, not only is there a chemical change in the DNA that we can see the expression in gene expression in 3 generations, but I've discovered also that there's clues that are left behind in the form of emotionally charged words.
This is Gene Montrestell, and welcome to the Tapping Q&A podcast, recorded live to tape from Williamsburg in Brooklyn. This is episode 473, originally aired August 5th, 2020. Hi, everyone. I hope this finds you well wherever you are and whatever time of day you're getting a chance to listen to this. Thanks for spending some time with me today. Today, we are going to have an amazing conversation about the difference between generational trauma and attachment trauma and the language of trauma, how we describe our experience and how we describe ourselves, and how that will lead to the actual root causes of what we are dealing with. But before I do that, I just want to send a big shout out to all of the supporters of the Tapping Q&A podcast. A special thank you to Joe. Joe is the most recent person to support the podcast. Joe and all of the supporters of the Tapping Q&A podcast receive some amazing bonuses. And because of supporters like Joe and all of the other supporters, starting next week, we're going to be able to start providing transcripts to many of the past episodes. Some of them will be current ones, some of them will be the best of the past, but it's an opportunity for you to engage with the work in a different way if you don't like listening, but you would rather read the information and read the interviews. And again, this is only possible because of the people who voluntarily said, yes, I think the podcast is important. I want it to keep growing. If you would like to be like Joe and be a supporter of the podcast, all you need to do is go to tappingqanda.com/support, and you'll see the way that you can support the show and receive some amazing thank you gifts for that support. Today's interview is with Mark Wolynn, and Mark is one of my favorite guests. And part of the reason why he's one of my favorite guests is he is coming from a place where what he is researching and what his work is about is informative to the way that I'm able to do tapping. And he's coming from a place and an experience that is completely foreign from where my training and my expertise is. Back in podcast 292, Mark talked about the epigenetics of trauma. And basically what that means is that through our DNA, from one generation to the next, we can pass trauma along. So if you have a parent who, as a young child or at any point before you were born, had a really traumatic experience with water and they now have a fear of water, that fear can be passed along through the DNA, and it is one of the reasons why sometimes when you're tapping on something, you can't find an initial sensitizing event. You can't find a place in your past where you were impacted, so you have something to tap on. And so this conversation, and if you didn't listen to 292, tappingqanda.com/292, the link is in the show notes. It gives you a primer on the epigenetics trauma and just kind of talks about how it shows up. In this conversation, what we do is we talk about the difference between that generational trauma, the trauma that has been passed down to us, and attachment trauma, trauma that comes from attachment issues from when we are young. And because of the language, and Mark calls it trauma language, because of the language that we use to describe our experience, we have the opportunity to figure out, is it attachment trauma or is it generational trauma? And so it's a really great way for us to understand what's going on. The other thing I want to point out before we jump into the interview is right at the top of the interview, Mark goes through a case study. And he kind of talks about how he started to understand the difference when working with clients between generational trauma and attachment trauma before he started doing all of the research and the work that he has done now. And what I want you to pay attention to is how effortless he moves from different tools and different techniques as he walks us beat by beat through. And so when I talk about the art of delivery, that is what I am talking about. It's not just knowing how to do all of the tools that he uses, but knowing how to deploy them in a way that helps transformation happen really quickly. And the story that he tells and the fact that all of this happened in one session and his client's life changed so dramatically is a demonstration of the power of that art of delivery. If you would like to be better with your tapping and mastering that art of delivery, I've put a training together. If you go to masteringtheartofdelivery.com, masteringtheartofdelivery.com, you'll see my training on that particular thing. If you use the discount code podcast, you'll get 50% off of that training. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Mark. What got you initially trying to look into or realize that there was a connection between trauma and the stuff that is coming in generations before us? Like, how did the light switch go on?
Yeah, it was a big accident because I had no idea what I was looking for. I was used to working with the childhood or attachment, but I never thought to consider any generational input until I had this case. I think we're going back almost 30 years. I was working with a young woman, 24 years old, who was a cutter. I'll call her Sarah for the sake of the interview. And the strange way about how Sarah cut is she would cut into her arms or legs or abdomen so deeply that she'd hit a major vessel, a vein, an artery, and almost bleed to death. And her parents would have to rush her to the hospital, and she'd spend, 2, 3, 4 weeks in a psych ward because they thought she was trying to kill herself. And one day when I was working with a lot of cutters during this time, but Sarah was the one that flipped the switch. And what happened is one day as we were working together, she had just come back from the psych ward. I handed her a pen, and I said, Sarah, pretend this is the knife that you use and put it against your arm as though you're going to cut. And let's explore exactly what happens in that second, in that moment. And as she took the pen and she placed it to her arm, I saw her begin to dissociate and glaze over and trance out. And I said, right there, Sarah, right there. What's the feeling? What's the urge? What's that impulse? What's that sentence? And she looked at me and said, I deserve to die? And here I am looking at a 24-year-old woman whose life has just begun. And I asked the obvious questions. I said, what did you do? What did you do? Did you cause an accident? Did someone die? Did you break up with someone who took his or her life? She said, no, nothing like that. So I did the usual, what I knew how to do back then. I looked at her relationship with her mother and her father, and there were no clues there because she had this loving, loving relationship with both of her parents. She could receive their love and their nurturance and their care and their tenderness. So I said, well, it has to be an attachment. So I started to explore the birth and the in utero experience, the birth trauma. There was none. She had this exquisite attachment with her mom, secure, safe, strong. So I didn't know what to do. And luckily, I asked this question. I said, Sarah, tell me about your grandparents. And I just threw it out there. And sure enough, boom, she dropped the bomb. Her grandmother, her father's mother, was an alcoholic. And she was driving the car drunk. And grandpa was in the passenger seat. And she crashed into a telephone pole. She lived. But grandpa went through the windshield and got cut, lacerated on the glass, and bled to death. Bled to death. before the ambulance could arrive. So in that moment, I went, oh, the light bulbs went on. In that moment, when she cut herself so deeply that she nearly bled to death, she was connecting somehow, what I didn't understand at the time, with her grandfather. And when she had the feeling, I don't deserve to live, she was connecting to the feeling of her grandmother who took another life, the life of her beloved. And because I was a student of psychodrama at the time, I immediately put two chairs out in the middle of the room for her grandfather and her grandmother. And I said, Sarah, tell your grandfather what you do. And she said, well, Grandpa, I cut myself. Tell him how deeply you cut. I cut myself so deeply that I nearly bleed to death. And then I said, Sarah, add the words like you did. And she said, like you did. And she's all in tears and very emotional. And I said, Sarah, close your eyes. What's he saying? What's he showing you? And she says, he doesn't want me to do this. He told me that he'll be there with me as a support, that when I go to cut, to feel him with me, which this is another place where I learned to deepen working with visualizations and images. And I said, so in other words, when you go to cut, feel him there with you, supporting you. And she said, yeah, I can feel him with me now. He's really loving and support. Then she turned to the other chair, to her grandmother. And I said, tell her what you told me. Grandma, I have this feeling that I don't deserve to live. And this isn't my feeling. This must have been what you felt for crashing the car and taking Grandpa's life. And Grandma, I thought that was my feeling. And I said, tell her, add these words. Grandma, that's your feeling. And she said it. And the grandma, I had her close her eyes and visualize the grandmother with her. It was potent. She never cut again. She actually never cut again. Wait, let's go another step. Then I had her bring her father into the session while she sat on the couch, because the healing needed to happen with her dad. So I had her dad in my chair, and he couldn't grieve his father because of the rage he felt toward his mother. They died. Okay, the grandfather died when he was 12. And then the grandmother died from alcoholism. At that point, it really spurred on her alcoholism. He died when he was 20. But in his healing with his dad, it was his rage toward his mom. So he couldn't really grieve the father, because what stood in the way was his rage toward the mother. And he had a broken relationship with the mother. So I had this idea. Luckily, the spirits were with me, Gene, because I had this idea. I didn't know what I was doing, but I said, well, wait a minute, your mother drank. What happened behind your mother that made her? Tell me about her history. And sure enough, he told me that she was given away at age 3 to foster care. And I said, oh, of course she drinks. She's looking for dopamine. She's looking for her mother. She's trying to escape the intolerable loneliness that lived in her. And so all of a sudden he could feel compassion for his mother. He could grieve his father. What he did in the session was profound. He grieved in one session. He was able to grieve his father, and then he was able to open his heart to his mother. And this was amazing. At the end of the session, he gets up, he turns toward his daughter, and he says, I've got this. I've got this. And in that moment, you could see her breathe out this sigh of, I don't have to carry this anymore. And this opened my eyes completely to the idea of inherited family trauma. And then, of course, I ran into Bert Hellinger, who becomes my greatest teacher, who's teaching about family constellations, which is a method for healing the effects of inherited trauma. And there you go. I was off and running.
And so inside of that, what you did is, and I would love to hear you kind of pull these apart and talk about these and compare and contrast, that you talked about two different types of things going on. One was from this point of view of attachment that the grandmother had experienced because of her experience of being letting go. And the other was this sense of generational. And as we look at those two types of things, can you compare and contrast them, and also compare and contrast how they impact us, and if there is a difference as we're kind of living through something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Those of your listeners who've read my book know that I'm a big fan of trauma language. That I'm looking to unearth this language that lives inside of us unconsciously. And some of the questions that I ask in the book, there's maybe one of the big questions is, what's your worst fear? What's the worst thing that could happen to you if things went terribly wrong? If things suddenly fell apart, what's your worst fear? And when people answer that question, they unearth two types of languages. One is generational, sort of, which we heard Sarah say, I don't deserve to live. That's not her language. That lives in the generational, that lives in the family history, because it was grandma who didn't deserve to live. But then there's this whole other type of language that I see as attachment language. And for example, when somebody says, when I ask, what's your worst fear? What's the worst thing that could happen to you? Things went terribly wrong. Many people will tell us, I'll be all alone. I'll be abandoned. I'll be rejected. I'll be left all alone. I'll lose control. I'll be helpless. I'll be powerless. Even I'll be homeless. This is attachment language. Even a sentence like I'll be homeless, we're a child without a mother when there's a break in the attachment. If it's very early attachment language, it's I won't exist. If there's events in utero, I'll be annihilated by the cortisol. I'll be destroyed. I'll be annihilated. Attachment language, which is also generational, as we find, because we know that from the mice studies, we know that we inherit our mother's relationship with her mother and our father's relationship with his mother. And then we have to contend with our own early relationship with our mother. So we never quite know from which direction, where the attachment is coming from. For example, the most replicated study in all of epigenetics is they separate baby mice from their mothers for a short period of time, sometimes for only 2 hours a day for the first 3 weeks of life. And then they bring the mothers back, or they bring the babies back, or they take the mother and put her in a tube and stress her out, a glass tube, and bring her back. So she's a stressed out mother like our stressed out mothers. And then they look at the effect of the babies, and they see that these baby mice exhibit behaviors, symptoms like what we would call depression in humans. And then they take the sperm from these mice and they inject it into females that were not separated, mothers, pregnant. They fertilize the fertilized eggs of mice, and they see for the subsequent 2 generations, 3 generations in all, the pups and the grandpups, we have depressed mice. And they take these mice even and they drop them. There's a researcher, Isabelle Monsuy. She takes the mice in the first generation, drops them in a bowl of water. And these mice that have been separated, that are depressed, they float and drown. They don't swim. They don't try to escape. Whereas the mice that didn't have a trauma with the mother, they're racing around the edge of the bowl of the water trying to get out. In the next 2 generations, by just dropping one of these mice, the pups or the grandpups, into a bowl of water, they as well have inherited the freeze response and float and drown if the researcher doesn't take them out of the bowl. In other words, they've inherited the depressed behavior of that pup in the first generation. So I was talking about this language, this trauma language. The generational language, it has a different sound. Whereas the attachment language has the sound of I'll be abandoned, I'll be left, I'll be alone, there'll be no one there. The generational language is I'll hurt someone, I'll be hated, I'll be ostracized, I'll be sent away, I'll be forgotten, I'll go crazy, they'll lock me up, I'll do something terrible, I won't deserve to live, I'll kill somebody. That's a different quality of language. Just by hearing that language, if I ask someone a question, what's your worst fear? And they start to answer that question, it will unearth one of 2 types of language, which will lead my next questions into the direction of where we go.
I'm curious because answer to the attachment trauma makes perfect sense to me. Why does generational trauma show up in the type of answers that you just gave there? Like the attachment stuff, like I'll be alone. That makes sense. What do you have a hypothesis or an understanding of?
I
Yeah.
do.
And what is that? I'm curious.
So again, I'm going to go back to this idea of trauma language, Gene. Because I've discovered that when a trauma happens, not only is there a chemical change in the DNA that we can see the gene expression in 3 generations, but I've discovered also that there's clues that are left behind in the form of emotionally charged words and sentences that form a breadcrumb trail. And it's essential that we learn to listen because it can hold the missing piece of the puzzle and lead us back to that one event in the family history that turns on the lights. Why, for Sarah, she finds this car crash, and all of a sudden she realizes that she's been carrying her grandmother's generational trauma language. But going back to trauma language, let's go back into trauma theory. What we know from trauma theory is when there's been a traumatic event, significant information bypasses the frontal lobes. So the experience of exactly what happened in the trauma can't be named or ordered in words because our language centers become compromised. And then without language to corral it, our experiences are stored as fragments of memory, fragments of body sensation, fragments of images, fragments of this trauma language, fragments of emotion. It's like the mind disperses and essential elements get separated. It's like we lose the story and never complete the healing. But what I found is these pieces aren't lost, Gene. They've just been rerouted and they resurface in our verbal and our nonverbal trauma language. So when it's verbal, let's go back to Sarah. When it's verbal, she said, I don't deserve to live. But that was generational trauma language living in Sarah that didn't belong to her. She's not the originator of that language. Because I checked it out with her. What did you do? Why wouldn't you deserve to live? I don't know. In other words, we carry this language that's not ours. But when it's nonverbal language, and Sarah had a version of that too, we look for the physical or the emotional symptoms that show up after an unsettling event in our lives. For example, we look for the fears or the anxieties that strike suddenly when we reach a particular age. Often it's the same age that something traumatic happened in our family history. Or we look for the depression, or in Sarah's case, the destructive behaviors or the self-sabotaging behaviors that arise after a situation that's similar to a trauma in her family history. So whenever she was probably feeling alone or distressed, or as though she were losing control, or something terrible was happening, it would lead her to cut. Now, in Sarah's story, her non-verbal trauma language is that she cut so deeply that she almost bled to death. That's the nonverbal. So I'm hearing this language of why is she cutting so deeply and almost bleeding to death, and that nonverbal language was leading me to her grandfather without me even knowing it.
And the reason why this was, in this particular case, that was so striking is typically cutters aren't people who cut that deeply.
That's right.
So therefore you had this outlier of an action that then gave you the opportunity to investigate that, to kind of figure out what was sitting behind that particular thing. That was exactly the language. Right. The language piece of it is they are doing something physically that is an outlier, so that is communicating something different.
That's exactly right. So not only is in our behaviors, our destructive behaviors, but Gene, it's even in this nonverbal trauma language. It's mirrored in our relationship struggles, who we choose, how we choose. It's in the repeated ways we deal with money, success. I mean, it's all over the place. You just have to, when we learn to look in this direction, when readers read my book, when clinicians actually read my book, what happens is they pick up this other way of seeing and reading the symptoms, the symptom picture, really the pieces of the puzzle, the pieces of the case that we could take for granted. When somebody tells us as clinicians, they say, I'm depressed, or here, I have migraine headaches. And we don't pursue this further, when did the migraine start? When was your first migraine? What happens right before it? What happens in its worst moments, this migraine? What makes it better? What makes it worse? What age were you in the first? What was anybody else that age in the family? And there's certain questions that we learn to peel back the layers and then follow that breadcrumb trail, and that can lead us back to inherited family trauma.
One of the questions that I ask without looking through this lens, but I have just found as a question I find really useful is, I know you don't know the answer to this question, which I love as a pre-frame. What does it remind you of? And it just giving them this chance to almost see this look when, because a lot of times it doesn't remind them anything, but when it does, you can almost see this dawning visualization on their face of like, well, actually, it reminds me of fill in blank of some sort of a location, a time, an experience, a person. And it's a connection that they haven't made at that point either, because you can literally see the revelation on their face. Like,
it's a great question.
My single favorite statement a client will ever make to me is, this probably has nothing to do with it, but.
Right.
The moment that is going on, I'm just doing a little bitty happy dance, like, okay, we're going in the right direction, because you as a bad eyewitness of your own experience have found something you didn't expect. Therefore, we're going to find some gold in this that we can really do some transformational with.
Great. Yeah, great.
You gave some of the examples of the nonverbal stuff. I'm curious, like in the story of Sarah, you mentioned one of the things that happened as she was retelling the story was this almost glazing over disassociation in that particular experience. Is that a key that it is something that is generational that is showing up and that's why she's disassociating? Or was the disassociation just because it's so painful and she's just trying to get out of mind as she's reliving that particular thing?
I didn't even bother to unpack that part. Once the language comes out, and the story comes out. It's not a bad question. It's a good exploration is what happens before these elements of our own traumatic repeating come out. Are we in some form of dissociation? I would say we're definitely our stress response is active. So I would say we're definitely not in the prefrontal cortex where we can heal. We're actually sitting in the trauma brain, the limbic system where there's the alarm signals are firing to the alarm towers of our body, and we're either repeating or behaving in some way or saying really traumatic reliving.
As you are uncovering this stuff, you're getting a chance to use whatever modality, somatic, otherwise, in the moment to clear this particular stuff. What are you seeing either in the clients that you work with or in the research is the lasting impact of doing this sort of work? Are we seeing temporary relief? Are we seeing long-term relief? Obviously, it's much easier to do with mice because of the reproduction. Are we seeing the healing passed along generationally? Like, once you've made this revelation, now we're doing something in the moment. What are the medium to long-term consequences now that we're doing this sort of work and thinking this way?
Why, Gene? Because I only give you the bad news, right? That we're all in the same boat. We're all in the same boat and it's sinking. It's like, there's actually a lot of good news. So I'm glad you brought up the mice because, right now, researchers are able to reverse the trauma symptoms in mice, and the implications are vast. So what they do is they take these traumatized mice that they've been able to instigate some form of traumatic experience and maybe even repeat that experience. But then when they take these same mice as adults, and expose them to positive experiences, it changes the way their DNA expresses. So technically, it inhibits the enzymes that cause DNA methylation and histone modifications, which are two of the mechanisms of epigenetic transfer. So, I mentioned this Isabelle Monsuit, this researcher, when she dropped those mice in the bowl, later in life, she takes those same mice and exposes them to these positive, low-stress environments, and noticed that their trauma symptoms reversed, their behaviors improved. There were changes, in the DNA methylation, which prevented the symptoms from being transmitted to the next generation. And I think in the first time we talked together, I also talked about those mice that were shocked every time they smelled the cherry blossom scent. Well, that research also goes on after, he goes on and he takes, Brian Diaz was his name. Those mice that had learned to fear the cherry blossom scent, they're taught not to fear it by repeatedly being exposed to it and then not getting shocked. And what was interesting is these mice no longer showed the heightened sensitivity to the scent. That's like us no longer having the heightened sensitivity to our trauma or our trigger. And not only that, but their sperm lost the fearful epigenetic signature that could pass to future generations. And so they were producing offspring that didn't have the trauma. And I'm talking about mice. Mice obviously aren't the only ones who benefit from positive experiences. The second part of your question is it's how we heal. So, it's how we heal from inherited trauma. We've got to calm the brain stress response, whether, and this is an important sentence, whether we've inherited that stress response or whether the trauma happened to us in our lifetime, in our early life, or so it's still the same healing. To heal, we've got to have positive experiences that can change our brain, and then we need to practice, as we know, the new feelings and the new sensations associated with these new positive experiences. And then when we do this, as we know, we not only create new neural pathways in the brain, but we also stimulate the release of feel-good neurotransmitters like serotonin, like dopamine, like GABA, or also stimulate the release of feel-good hormones like estrogen and oxytocin. And probably the part that excites me the most is even the very genes involved in the body's stress response, they can start to function in a new or improved way. Yeah.
One of the analogies I've started using, I would love to hear your feedback on this, is when we have a piece of trauma stuck inside of us, it's almost like we've taken a rubber band and we've stretched it really tight for a really long period of time, so that when we undo it, we have deformed the way the rubber band is supposed to function because it has been under stress for so long that it doesn't bounce back in the exact same way. Where if I have something come up and I process the trauma and I flush it through my system in a natural way, in a healthy way, in a short-term fashion, the rubber band bounces back into shape and it's as if it was before. It stretched, it handled, and it came back. By leaving it stretched for a long period of time, it starts to change the nature of the rubber so it doesn't bounce back in the same way.
Right.
So we're now living this that is less functional, dysfunctionally. But we're saying is, unlike the rubber band, when we now at some point in the future, regardless how that stretch happened, be it our own trauma or one that was given to us generationally, we can actually heal it so it does bounce back and it goes back to its original state if we start dealing with it now.
Oh, absolutely. Well put. I guess from my perspective, in a nutshell, when we practice being with the uncomfortable sensations in our body, we can get beneath them. So we can practice being with our nausea, our tightness, our numbing out, till we can reach what's beneath them, the sensations that we experience in the body as life-giving. Sensations like pulsing, tingling, softening, expanding, blood flowing, waves of energy, warmth, and then for me, it's being able to hold those positive sensations for at least 60 seconds, for at least a minute, and do this 6 times a day. And that can be enough to change the brain stress response.
That's awesome.
Now,
and the thing that I love about that is like it's so attainable. I can put a reminder into my calendar that goes off 6 times a day where I am now going to do something, because creating that sort of sensation, be it through tapping, be it through visualization, the self-applied modalities that we have access to be able to create that little 60-second bite multiple times a day just becomes an act of the will and discipline to be able to do that, to see something so powerful coming out of that.
Well put. Yeah, that's really the key, isn't it? To pull traction away from the trauma brain and bring engagement to the forebrain, where we can process what's happening. Sometimes I'll have a client hold 2 places in the body where they feel a positive sensation and integrate, or even where they feel what's negative, actually holding opposites, holding opposites, and integrate as though they're calling back young parts of themselves that had fragmented and sometimes I'll give a language around it. Like, for example, I've got you, and I'll breathe with you. I'll breathe with you until we can integrate as one, or I'll hold you so we don't have to hold our body so tightly, or I'll breathe with you until you feel safe to return to our body. It's almost like we're speaking to these young parts of us.
And I love hearing you say that, because I do a significant amount of that with my clients, where how old do you feel in this sensation? And then we just go and we have this conversation, and we give the younger part permission to stop being the adult in whatever situation that they felt like they had to be the adult in, and let the adult take over and the child to turn back into a child.
Right.
And we create playgrounds and play friends and like doing all of those things in that space. And so it's always encouraging to hear someone doing something similar and seeing value in the processing of that sort of stuff.
Like minds are drawn together.
Awesome. Well, as always, Mark, I so appreciate this sort of stuff, that when we can see, I think one of the things I think I love about having this conversation is I have so many clients who, because they are self-aware of starting to have language around knowing that they have trauma, is there's a lot of blame around the fact that I allowed this to happen, or I'm still carrying this thing for me. And when we recognize that we're picking up these things, we're carrying these things that have been passed on that are not our responsibility because we weren't around when it happened, that it creates a little space of liberation to go, okay, this is now an object I'm dealing with that is impacting me, and I have less ownership over it. And just giving people that little bit of disassociation, half a step away from this thing, I've found created so much powerful space to allow healing to happen, and to know that it isn't just we're doing this mental exercise, that we know from research that that's actually what is happening and why that is valuable. That becomes such a powerful tool to be able to share with our clients. And so the fact that you're doing all this work just means so much to me, that I get to be able to share it in a practical way day to day.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me on your show again. I always enjoy talking with you, Gene.
This is one of those interviews and conversations that I would really encourage you to go back and re-listen to 2 or 3 times, because he's not talking about the subtleties of tapping, but he's talking about really how we understand trauma. And again, if you were anything like me, the way he is talking about it makes perfect sense, but it's a new way of thinking about it. And since the interview, since re-listening to it a couple of times as I was editing the audio to get it ready for you, I've had the opportunity to dive into this a couple more times. And this is just such an amazing, stellar piece of information and contact. If you really enjoy this conversation, I'd encourage you to check out all of Mark's work. If you go to tappingqna.com/473, which is this particular episode, you'll see his contact information, how to get on his newsletter and things like that. If you're looking for a resource, he's written a book called It Didn't Start With You, which is about the information of the epigenetics of trauma. But more importantly, it also has a whole bunch of tools and questions that we even talk about it a little bit in this interview that will help you as you're trying to figure out what's going on with yourself or someone else. I've been in the process over the course of the last couple of months to be writing a tapping book on tapping and trauma. And the publisher gave me the opportunity to list 10 and only 10 resources at the end of the book to send people to. And I included this book. I think that highly of it. Even if it is not a tapping book, if you are doing any sort of work with yourself or someone else in trauma, I think this is an absolute essential read. It's called It Didn't Start With You. If you go to tappingqna.com/473, I have a direct link in the post that will take you where you can find that particular book. If you enjoyed this interview and you know someone else in your life who would appreciate this particular conversation, please pass it along. You don't have to spam your inbox and send it to everybody in the world. But if you know 1 or 2 people who could really use this, share it with them. Once this goes live, I have a number of people I know I'm going to be passing it along to directly, because I think, again, that much of Mark's work in this particular conversation. If you have a topic or something you'd think we should cover in the future, please let me know. The way that I originally found my way to Mark's work was because of a recommendation from a listener just like you. So taking a moment and just sending me an email and saying, hey, this is a really awesome person, I think you should check them out. I take those recommendations seriously. And a recommendation from someone you don't know and someone I don't know, just a listener, passed along a name that has really transformed the way I think about trauma, and hopefully you got a lot out of that too, and that's a way we can support each other in community. Shoot me a note, Gene, Gene, at tappingqna.com. If you have questions about anything at all, I can always be reached at that exact spot. I read all those emails. It doesn't go to a VA. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the podcast. In podcasting parlance, subscribe is always free. You can subscribe to the show in Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Pandora, Spotify, Stitcher, radio.com, iHeartRadio. Anywhere you get audio, you can find it. Simply search Tapping Q&A. Whatever device, whatever application, whatever website you're looking in, click the subscribe button, click the follow button. It doesn't do anything specifically for me, but what it does for you is it makes sure that each time a new episode comes out, it is delivered to you right away without any mess or any wait. For the Tapping Q&A podcast, this is Gene Montrestelli. I hope you have a great day, and I will talk to you real soon. Bye-bye. The Tapping Q&A podcast is copyright Gene Montrestelli Tapping Q&A. All views expressed by guests are those of the guests and not necessarily of Gene Montrestelli and Tapping Q&A.